Kitco News coverage of FreedomFest is brought to you by Coin Payments, crypto payments made easy.
Economic problems are causing civil unrest from Sri Lanka to the Netherlands. Could this be a harbinger of things to come? Could the US be facing similar protests and riots? Let's discuss this and more with my next guest, Max Borders. Max is the executive director of Social Evolution, a nonprofit devoted to solving social problems through innovation. Max is the author of several books, including The Social Singularity, The Decentralist, and After the Collapse. Max, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
It's not a very pretty picture that you paint in After the Collapse, so let's start there. And I'd like to read an excerpt from your book and have you explain how we get to this scenario. And I'm quoting you here. After the Collapse, published last year, you predict the following: where once there were credit cards, there will be guns. Preppers in the countryside will hunker down behind fences with signs that read, "Trespassers will be shot on sight." And we will suddenly admire them for their foresight. Most have forgotten how to plant, most have forgotten how to husband animals, and those who haven't will be defending their flocks and hen houses from you and me as we lurk in the woods, considering a rather unseemly career change. Max, this is a rather unseemly picture that you paint of the not too distant future. So help me understand, how exactly do we get from where we are here to that very, very bleak future?
Thank you for picking out the darkest passage in the entire book, but it's
Well, that is the collapse that you predict.
yeah.
Tell me how we get there from where we are now.
Sure.
And I hope we don't get there, but how do you,
I'm with you. I hope we don't get there either, but I think it's quite possible.
so what does that terrifying journey look like from where we are now to this scenario that you've painted?
Sure, and I don't want to be, I want to keep some measure of humility in terms of talking about magnitude, talking about depth of some sort of collapse scenario, but I am more and more every day sort of starting to admire the preppers, and that was really because they're going to be ready for something like this.
Well, they're always ready. They're prepared by definition.
They're always ready, and I certainly am not. I've come to depend on my grocery store and my credit card and so on. The thing that I see that portends really sort of an awful state of affairs is that the greatest economic power in the world, with the world's reserve currency, is now its debt stands at 138% of GDP. That is a huge problem. You contrast that with the global problem of $300 trillion in leverage and debt in the system, with only 100 trillion economic output. That is a terrible contrast that I think needs to be looked at. But let's just imagine for a moment we're just talking about America as if it were hermetically sealed off from the rest of the global economy. We sit on the fork of what I call the tines of the devil's fork. On the one hand, that means that the Federal Reserve is running out of tricks. On the one hand, it can print money, it can inflate the currency in order to try to stimulate, where that stimulation is rather like giving a crack addict a little more crack in order to get through the day, but is not helping the underlying body of the addict. On the other hand, we have this measure that is, okay, we're going to raise interest rates. We're going to dial up interest rates. You often hear people speaking of it in terms of levers and dials, and I want to come back to that point in a moment. But that, of course, is going to change the incentives such that it's supposed to mute some of this inflation. We're not seeing that happen yet. That's scary, but this problematic sort of bind that the Federal Reserve is in, it's sort of painted itself into the corner. One wonders what it can continue to do into the future except bring pain in some form or fashion, and the question is, how does it spread out that pain? I also think, okay, and I'll leave it at that for the moment, just thinking in terms of the American experience.
But how does that spiral into the scenario that you've depicted, where I'm hunting for animals and learning how to farm?
Well, so I don't know that that's going to be everybody, right? there'll be people in their gated communities who have lots of money. But even if you had 10% of the population in dire circumstances, that is a lot of people roving around who are poor, who are looking for assistance, and they can't find it any. They're going to be demanding it from their government, but the more the government provides free goodies for people who need it most, right? So we've outsourced our sense of responsibility for our fellow man to distant capitals, and those distant capitals disperse funds as they did during COVID, which got us into this mess to begin with. At what point of debt to GDP ratio are we in the red zone, the danger zone? And the more problems we have, the more people are going to agitate for government to fix the problem, to fix the economy. So whether that's Congress, who has every incentive to fix things through this process, and then the Federal Reserve, which has to respond to it. It's deeply problematic.
It's deeply problematic, and to your point, it's the stimulus and the benefits that have gotten us into this problem in the first place, at least on a very large degree. This has, if we look at Sri Lanka, for example, we've seen how measures there have hurt the economy and have led to mass protests, people storming the house of the president, they're forcing him to resign. Is that the kind of scenario that you envision in your book after the collapse?
That's exactly right. I mean, that is just the sort of thing that I worry about. And it doesn't have to be the entire population. It could just be a sizable enough subset to make matters very dire and dreary for us all. You know, something on the order of the Great Depression. You know, it's funny when we think about these scenarios. When we go back in time, we've had these problems. We had the Great Recession and we've had the Great Depression, and we've had the dot-com bubble. All of these were supposed to be resolved through this idea of interventionism, the idea of economic interventionism by the central bank and by Congress. The idea that these mandarins, these macroeconomic wizards, can adjust the rheostats or dial up some feature of the economy to fix or run things in an appropriate way is just a broken model and inapt metaphor. It's based on Keynesianism, which is a bankrupt ideology, and its kissing cousins, the modern monetary theorists, have been whispering into the ears of power, and that's why we're at the state we're in. And I believe we're only at the beginning of something much worse and much more protracted and deep that we're only starting to see the first signs of. I worry about that tremendously. And I'm an optimist. I really
You don't sound like an optimist, Max.
But the book After Collapse, the after part is the optimism.
Right.
We can reconstitute institutions that work better.
But what makes you think that this will be worse than the Great Depression? Because it sounds like the picture that you paint is one that is worse than anything we've ever seen before. Why would this collapse, monetary reset of the system, if you will, be so much worse than anything we've seen before?
One reason I think is we have to think about the economy as an ecosystem that creates value, and that depends on productivity. When you start to use these tricks, these financial tricks, the Federal Reserve employs, where they have very restricted range of things they can do with these dials and rheostats, you know, again, the broken metaphor. Imagine you're trying to stick your hand into the Amazon rainforest or the Great Barrier Reef and run or fix those complex systems. You cannot possibly anticipate the unintended effects of doing that. And of course, we're seeing now that so-called transitory inflation wasn't transitory at all. That's because you cannot run, fix, or design a complex system. That's what we're living in. Now, you asked specifically about the magnitude of the problem. It's not just that the macroeconomic wizards are unable to do what they say they can do, which is to adjust the dials and the rheostats of this great economic machine. It is not a machine. They are reached the point that if you don't have something like extreme austerity, which is already going to cause all sorts of, not problems, but it is an only viable solution prior to institutional change, right? So austerity measures have worked But what is going to be the political incentive when everybody's crying about gas prices? Everybody wants some form of stimulus. They want something akin to what they got in COVID, and they've come to expect it politically. The political class is going to try to give it to them, but we right now are at 138% of GDP with our debt. There's not much more we can do except become Japan. And Japan, by the way, could be at the leading edge of such a global collapse because they're having problems right now too.
Well, we're now giving inflation relief checks in certain states in the United States, like California, for example, Maine and Hawaii, which again, to use your drug metaphor, is just giving more drugs to the addict, which makes him even more addicted.
Right.
If these austerity measures are implemented to a degree, which will take a very, very brave political party to do so, is that what causes this potential unrest?
It could. See, that's the thing. The cure at this point is it's almost like someone who has cancer. I'm using a lot of metaphors. I hope you don't mind.
We've got coral reefs, we've got machines, we've got cancer, but go ahead.
That's all right. Well, just imagine you have a sick patient, and the only way to treat that patient is something that's going to be really hard on that patient's body, but otherwise it's going to die. So, people, especially macroeconomists in the Keynesian tradition, don't like the word austerity because they think you can just use fiscal policy or monetary policy to fix the problem. But what it does is kick the can, or to change the metaphor up again, is to give the heroin to the addict.
All right, so we've been kicking the can down the road for so long, but you think we've now hit the end of the road potentially?
I think we're at the very beginning of something akin to the Great Depression, and I think we need to face that fact because, again, if we go into a recession, the political incentives are gimme, 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 help me, help me, help me.
Yeah.
But that takes us deeper into a situation in which we have to inflate the currency. But and inflation is part of the problem of people's check that they can't afford gas or meals or rent.
So we're at the beginning of the end. Why is cryptocurrency and particularly Bitcoin a potential solution here?
I think it's based on the idea that, you've heard probably in the mainstream media this idea that people have lost trust in the institutions, and it's true. I like to think of it as a way of switching systems. When you have a superior system, and it's not to say that Bitcoin is the best thing since sliced bread, it is, but it was a response to the problems of 2008 and 2009 that were sown by the government and by people who you might say are excessively greedy, right? They let their greed burn out of control. And look, I think greed is good to a degree, but when you are unwilling to look at an underlying economic reality and you're willing to collude with the government to sow the seeds of these problems, that's gonna be a problem because that's what we saw in 2008. And in 2009, we saw the advent of the Bitcoin white paper. That was Satoshi Nakamoto published the Bitcoin white paper during that time. And that was a direct response to the antics of the central bank. Now, that brought us quantitative easing and all of this stuff, which is, we have to ask moral questions about that sorry episode, where instead of allowing institutions to fail because it was, too big to fail and systemic collapse, what that ended up doing was creating moral hazard and enriching financial institutions that were already super rich, and that came at the expense of the rest of us.
Okay, so the idea of Bitcoin having limited supply and you can't create more Bitcoin, that was one of the big premises of the white papers from Satoshi Nakamoto. But how does Bitcoin save the day?
Well, I think the cryptocurrency landscape writ large can save the day. It may not be just Bitcoin. However, Bitcoin is very promising as a store of value, as an inflation hedge. Sadly, right now, people are treating it as a quote-unquote risk-on asset and dumping it like a tech stock. But that's not really, that sort of shows a failure of institutional money and for that matter, some retail investors of improperly understanding the properties of Bitcoin. Bitcoin as an inflation hedge, all it needs to do is, it is liquid, but it depends on solidarity. If we stick together and hold Bitcoin, then it will maintain its price, won't be as volatile. That volatility, though, is a problem from a systemic standpoint. You have to acknowledge that. But there is no perfect being the enemy of the good. Gold could be just as volatile if everybody started using it as a inflation hedge and started speculating on gold.
Well, people do use gold as an inflation hedge. That has been,
and it's a good one.
And it hasn't had the level of volatility. If you look at Bitcoin as a store of value, it's hard to make that argument recently with Bitcoin down 70% from its all-time high. Yeah. So
now, that liquidity can contribute, and the fact that there are very few people right now relative to the entire economy, I believe, and we've seen this bear out, that over time, as more people adopt cryptocurrencies, and in particular Bitcoin, we're going to see that volatility die down. We have seen that to some degree. It's not to say we haven't had punctuated moment here in the crash, but with time we have seen volatility go down as adoption rates go up. With a bigger ocean, whales can do less damage or make fewer splashes, I guess you could say, relative to the entire pond. So that Bitcoin adoption through time is going to be a good thing, I believe. But it's not just about Bitcoin. It has great network effects, it has great properties, but there are other cryptocurrencies, such more anonymous cryptocurrencies such as Monero, and Zcash can be anonymized. Bitcoin is also going to be anonymized soon, wallet anonymization, but also the idea that it's sound money, it's the soundest money in the world. In 1933, FDR confiscated America's gold, in part to try to deal with the problems of the New Deal. of the Great Depression with the New Deal. That was a part of that strategy from the Brain Trust. That is, I have, serious issues with that on a moral basis, but, the pretext at the time was we're going to fix or run the economy, and it took confiscating gold to do so. I don't think we have that anymore, particularly because we don't have a gold standard, so that's not going to happen. But the idea that the government can easily confiscate assets is not so much the case with a distributed ledger that lives simultaneously on thousands and thousands of computers around the world. So yes, there's volatility, I acknowledge that. But at the end of the day, if we have solidarity around this fact, Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies can be a good, in it. And by the way, just good old investing 101, you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. You want to have a diversified portfolio of cryptos.
All right, well, this is essentially a libertarian conference, and Bitcoin does seem to fit in to the libertarian ideology. You've in fact written that as crypto crashes, it's a good time to remember the mission, morality, and meaning must always come before money. So expand on that idea for us, how Bitcoin and libertarian ideology and values sort of merge together.
Yeah, I think, this has for me, in my new book, The Decentralist, for me, it's about understanding that, forgive me, I know we're in the United States, so I have a little bit of a nostalgia for patriotism. There's a clause in the Declaration of Independence called the consent of the governed, which means that we can literally opt into systems that we choose, warts and all. I value a system more than some other system. I don't want any force, any government compulsion to block the exits as they burn down the theater. That's the matrix of the dollar we're seeing right now. So the ideas are going to regulate cryptocurrencies, are going to regulate Bitcoin and give us a Fed coin. That is a horrible idea for me. I believe that people should be allowed to opt into any system they choose and live by those auspices as long as they're not hurting anyone else. That is a more or less libertarian ethos. And so if that is the mission, is to get us to a state of affairs we have more opt-in governance, we have more systems where we can choose the properties of that system and the rules and regulations of that system as we like, even if it's a communist one. I should have that choice, and that choice should be sovereign. So in that sense, it's very libertarian. The genesis of Bitcoin was the idea that we create a system that you could opt out of, or at least as closely as possible, that you could opt out of the dollars matrix if you needed to, and anything that's denominated in dollar assets, and secure your funding without permission. And that permissionless innovation has a very libertarian spirit. But there's also the idea, and I want to acknowledge this, that there is a lot of scammers and bad actors in the crypto space writ large.
Right.
So if there are true crypto believers out there, you need to bring a moral sensibility of not trying to take advantage, and think of it as an effort in building new institutions, because we will trust the institutions that we build and use together. And that, to me, is the promise of the crypto space.
Well, Max, regarding institutions, in the traditional meaning, there has been the speculation that Bitcoin will soar further when there's more institutional adoption. I'm talking about big pension funds and bigger banks. And then Bitcoin becomes a bigger part of the traditional financial system. We're waiting for a Bitcoin spot ETF, for example. Isn't being part of the traditional financial system, which will lead the price, as speculators say, to soar even further, antithetical to the very ethos of Bitcoin?
That's a good question. I'll say tentatively that I don't know. I will refer you to the idea of Gresham's law. And, the basic punchline of Gresham's law is that bad money drives out good money, right? So this liquidity among systems that we're seeing right now, and I'm not a Bitcoin maximalist, so please tell your viewers, do not throw tomatoes at the screen, but I have a very, very strong appreciation for Bitcoin, and I think its soundness makes it at the center of any good portfolio. But cryptocurrencies have other properties, and those are continuously evolving in a great churning ecosystem of value. So when we get crypto winters like this, stronger, better, faster, more efficient, and sounder currencies come out of it with tremendous properties. If some of these DeFi plays end up, going bankrupt, it's because people didn't evaluate their risk successfully. And of course, you have to consider it within the wider ecosystem of the dollar matrix and the Federal Reserve, which also can have knock-on effects within crypto. It's not hermetically sealed. That being said, the more people learn about the properties of crypto and understand them and, exercise some degree of agency and solidarity with each other in embrace of them, we will see less volatility and more improvements. And it can be, to some degree, at the center of new institutions. Or we could just go back to a gold standard. I would not turn that down at all.
Well, I want to go back to where I began this interview, which was with the quote of the horrible future that you predict. In that scenario, again, if I'm hunting and foraging for food, stands to reason that there could be a major issue with the electric grid and that the internet would be down. So how do cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin fit in to that terrible scenario that you're predicting, if it is indeed that severe?
Yeah, if the electrical grid goes down in the manner that you're describing.
What's the manner you're describing? I'm quoting how you describe the collapse in your book.
Well, I don't remember talking about the electrical grid going down, but that's certainly possible.
I'm just presuming that if I'm hunting for food, that it's gone down that road of lack of electricity and lack of infrastructure as well.
And that could be something that happens for 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years. We don't know. And no one knows the magnitude of any such collapse. I certainly don't. I guess when I'm, what I was getting with painting that dire picture is that there is the interconnectedness of these systems that Congress and the Federal Reserve wants to try to control or fix, makes it more fragile, right? So that fragility could create serious problems. And I take sort of artistic license because I don't know the depth of it. But if, as you say, you're without power for a long period of time because the electrical grid goes down permanently, we probably got bigger problems than just, because I'm not going to be able to access my gold that's sitting in a warehouse on the other side of the world. And, my dollars have already collapsed. So,
Well, you could have your gold in a chest under your bed, for argument's sake.
that's true, and that's hard to deal
If we're
to
going
deal
with this prepper scenario that you're painting.
Right. And look, I'm not a very good prepper, although I'm looking at the prepper saying maybe they didn't have it all wrong. Again, when you think in terms of having a balanced portfolio, maybe we ought to think in terms of having something like a more balanced prepper portfolio too. So it could be that one of the hedges or one of the safety mechanisms for things going off, the grid going down or something like that, would be that we hold gold, precious metals, a basket of goods that will retain their value. Even, Bitcoin will continue to exist even if you have the electrical grids go down around the world. That is a really frightening scenario, and I don't know how.
Assuming they get back online at some point.
Assuming they get back online, yeah, you'll just be able to reconstitute the Bitcoin network or any other cryptocurrency network. But if you have a little bit of precious metals, maybe some are held in a warehouse, but some are under your bed, as you put it. And I think that's not unwise. And of course, you have your crypto and your associated altcoins and your Bitcoin as well.
Again, it's a rather bleak picture that you paint. I hope that you're wrong, but I thank you for elaborating on that for us and breaking it down. And again, I hope the world does not break down.
Let me just put a lighter note on all this, and great questions, by the way. What is so promising to me is this great ecosystem of value that's constantly churning. When you go through these moments like these crypto winters, what comes out of it in an evolutionary ecosystem is continuous improvement in properties, okay? And it doesn't have to be digital. We can also reconstitute our governance institutions after a collapse as well. And of course, in the book, I have all kinds of ways that we can do that. It's the after collapse part that's really promising. I don't want a collapse to be able to usher in a new age where the phoenix rises from the ashes, but I think that that's what's coming, something like that, sadly. So there is a silver lining, but yeah, right now it's looking bleak.
So the silver lining is that we regroup and rebuild better than before.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Max, appreciate you joining us. Thank you so much, Max Portis.
Thank you for having me.
Kitco News coverage of FreedomFest is brought to you by Coin Payments, crypto payments made easy.